Alright guys, the second lecture is going to be about sensory information and how our body processes it. These two pathways, the PCML, which stands for posterior column medial lemniscus, and the ALS, which stands for anterolateral sequence, are very, 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 very high yield. We first have to review our anatomy. Since today we're just talking about sensory information, I'll draw this dividing line. Remember that a lot of things in the body, really I think everything in the central nervous system, because of the way that embryological development works, it's pretty cool, but everything's divided into sensory and motor on pretty recognizable dividing lines. The sensory information is associated with the dorsal side or the posterior side of the spinal cord, and the motor information is associated with the ventral or anterior side of the spinal cord. I want to draw your attention to this guy, DRG, dorsal root ganglion. And the DRG is a pseudo-unipolar neuron, which means that, a normal unipolar neuron just looks like that, right? A pseudo-unipolar neuron, think of it as having two arms. The DRG has a peripheral process where it receives sensory information, and then it has a central process where it gives information to the spinal cord, basically. And it's really like its own mini brain. Our lab studies this. I've spent many long nights extracting tiny DRGs from rats. So all your sensory information travels through your DRG. And while it's the DRG's sensing what's going on in the periphery, and it's also communicating with the central nervous system, so it's like the ultimate middleman for sensory information. So that's the DRG. This is the dorsal horn, and gray matter. Always think gray matter consists of neuronal cell bodies. There's usually a synapse happening here, and then white matter consists of tracts. And tracts have to be long, so they have to be myelinated, and that's what gives nervous tissue its white color. So that's why it's called white matter versus gray matter. Somatotopic organization. You probably remember seeing this because it's the creepiest thing ever. The best explanation for this is to think of the movie Hannibal when he cuts off the dude's face, and then so picture yourself cutting off your own face and then grabbing it and dangling by the forehead, and then as you're standing up you're leaning forward over the edge of your brain and just dangling it, and that's how I always remember what to wear. As you can tell, this is like the midline, and then as I move out laterally. So midline is legs, lower extremity, and this is true for motor and sensory. And then lateral cortex is responsible for face and arms. As you can see, most of the sensory, a lot of sensory cortex is devoted to the face, the gums and the tongue. And what else was I going to say? Yes, remember, there is something called the central gyrus in the brain. The precentral gyrus, which is in front, is motor, primary motor cortex. So any muscle movement, this is where the message starts. And then the primary sensory cortex is in the post-central gyrus. And so any sensory information from the periphery ends up synapsing here in the blue area. That organization also applies to the PCML travel pathways, so to speak, in that lower extremity is more midline and then upper extremity is more lateral. And this information travels in two fasciculi, I guess, and fasciculus is just a bundle of tracks, basically. And information from the lower extremity travels in the gracilis fasciculus, and the upper extremity information travels in the cuneatus fasciculus. And one way to remember that is gracilis is a muscle in your leg, and so then you know information from your legs travels in the gracilis fasciculus. Regarding the anterolateral system, responsible for pain and temperature transmission, there's also a layered organization here, neck, arm, trunk, and leg. Then one thing to remember, the names of the systems tell you where this information is traveling. So the anterolateral system is traveling, remember this side of the spinal cord is anterior and this is lateral, so it's traveling anterolaterally. And then the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway travels in the posterior column of the spinal cord, which, remember, this is the posterior column here. Okay. All right, so PCML pathway. Always think any information regarding fine touch, pressure, and remember that's especially where those mechanoreceptors are really important. 2-point discrimination, and that's where if you get touched on your back in one area and then, I don't know, a couple inches away you get touched in another area, you're able to tell exactly where that touch is happening. Vibration and proprioception are also transmitted in the PCML pathway. Vibration is tested with a tuning fork, so that's where you tap it on your hand and then hold it on somebody's leg. Proprioception is tested with something called the Romberg test, and that's where you stand up and you close your eyes, and if this pathway is compromised, you will lean or fall to one side or the other, and that's because your body doesn't know where it is in space. So again, here we see the concept of first order, second order, third order. Remember, the lower limb travels in the gracile fasciculus, and the upper limb information travels in the cuneate fasciculus. So all the information, this type of information, and A beta fibers are the type of nerve fibers that are mostly responsible for conveying this information. So we have these first order neurons. Something important is they ascend ipsilaterally in the spinal cord. So they go all the way up in those fasciculi we talked about, and then they synapse in their respective nuclei. And the names are the same, nucleus gracilis here, nucleus cuneatus here. And then, this is really, really important, they decussate or cross over to the contralateral side right here, kind of at the lower medulla or brainstem area. And at that point, the second order neurons in yellow go up and they synapse at the VPL, which is a specific nuclei in the nucleus and the thalamus. And then those third order neurons send their axons up, and they synapse in the respective area of the sensory cortex. So for instance, remember over here was face, creepy Hannibal face, right? You're dangling over the edge of the brain. So that means that information, all the sensory information for the face, is synapsed there. And if we're talking, let's do legs. And remember, legs were in the middle. Legs are lower limb. So let's say vibration sense in the lower limb, for example, would travel through its first order neuron, ascend ipsilaterally, and its lower limb, right? So it'll ascend in the gracile fasciculus. Its first order neuron will synapse in the nucleus gracilis. Second order neuron travel up through, synapse in the thalamus. The third order neuron will travel up to around here. Just remember this picture, right? Legs. Legs. And we'll synapse here on the fourth order neuron. Okay, next, the anterior lateral sequence. We'll also see this called spinothalamic tract. And two biggies, pain and temperature. Just memorize it now. Pain and temperature, pain and temperature, pain and temperature. These are transmitted by what's the sign for delta? I don't know. A delta and C fibers. And these, especially C fibers, are kind of high yield because they are unmyelinated, right? And when something's unmyelinated, it travels slower. So C fibers, information in C fibers travel the slowest out of all the fiber types. Because it's small diameter and unmyelinated. Okay, so we're talking pain and temperature. This is a little bit less straightforward than the PCML system, but it's not too bad. Okay, so we have our first order neuron. You'll also see the term primary afferent neuron. That senses pain and temperature information. And remember, this neuron has its cell body located in the DRG. And just remember that with all sensory information, the cell body is located in the DRG. And these neurons are really just extensions of the DRG in a way. You can think of it like that. So information travels up here, and then this is different from the PCML in that it immediately, well, I didn't say immediately, I'm gonna just hold off on that, but it synapses relatively quickly compared to the PCML, and it'll synapse either at the level of the pain. For instance, if the pain happened at, I don't know, T7 level, it can synapse at that level, or it can travel up the spinal cord via something called Lissauer's tract. And then it can synapse, for instance, at T5. So that's why you can get a spinal cord lesion, and then you'll have a loss of pain and temperature, not at that lesion and below, but at the level of two segments below the lesion and below. So, for instance, if the area of the spinal cord at T5 is knocked out, you lose pain and temperature. You will lose contralateral information about pain and temperature, from around T7 and below because of this Lissauer's tract. So anyway, one thing that is consistent is that it always synapses here in the dorsal horn, substantia gelatinosa, and then, muy importante, it decussates immediately, crosses over immediately. So that's why if the spinal cord's hit, you lose pain and temperature from the contralateral side. Okay, does that make sense? Because the information is crossing over right away. Whereas, remember with the PCML pathway, the information doesn't cross over until you get all the way up in the medulla. But with ALS, the information crosses over in the spinal cord. The second order neurons in yellow will travel all the way up to the thalamus, VPL, ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Synapse and those third order neurons will send their axons out, and then they'll synapse in the respective area of the sensory cortex in the same manner that the PCML pathway did. And remember, that's that homunculus type pattern. Don't get hung up on the anterior versus lateral spinothalamic tract. They really run together. They're kind of one and the same. And there is some crossover. You know, the ALS does transmit some information about touch, but it's something called crude touch. And then some information about pressure. But crude touch is still different from fine touch and discriminative touch. So anytime you hear fine touch or discriminative touch, the PCML pathway is responsible for that. Anytime you hear crude touch, the ALS is responsible for that. But mainly, these are going to be your big giveaways and question stems. Loss of pain and temperature. Loss of pain and temperature, then you know that this area has been compromised. And just to give you a little preview on spinal cord lesions. So if there's a spinal cord lesion, and remember we're talking spinal cord, right, not up top, then you would lose ipsilateral, and usually in the question stem they'll put loss of ipsilateral fine touch and proprioception. Fine touch and proprioception. And this is how, this is how they'll put it in a question stem. And then if the spinal cord was lesioned and the ALS was compromised, you'll see that contralateral loss of pain and temperature. Pain and temperature. Okay, this is just a reminder of where these tracks run, and the differentiation anatomically is really helpful because it tells you which part of the spinal cord is lesioned, because they're very separated. And this is the PCML information, and then the spinothalamic tract runs here. These are good review tables. As a review, so you'll also see DCML, which is dorsal column medial lemniscus. Same thing, PCML, DCML. Conveys proprioception, vibration sense, and fine discriminative touch. Those are all buzzwords for the PCML. And the decussation is in the lower medulla, where the information crosses over. The ALS, pain, temperature, crude touch. And the decussation is in the anterior commissure of the spinal cord. So that was right here. And this is in table form, if that helps you. We'll talk about the motor pathways later, but the lateral corticospinal tract, coming down from the brain, crosses over at a really close to where the PCML crosses over. And you know, if you were doing a physical exam, this is how you would test the pathways. For pain, you can use the really sharp, like, needle or pin prick. And for instance, if somebody has diabetes, they'll do that all the time, like poke them in the foot to see if how their pain perception is, or you know, if they can even feel it. So pain, temperature, coarse touch is another way you'll see it, coarse or crude touch. And then the PCML, light touch, vibration, 2-point discrimination, sense of position, aka proprioception. This is a good old dirty video. Does a better job than I do explaining these pathways. Worth your time, I would say, especially if this is all really new to you, or if it didn't really click. Me going through it, definitely watch that video.